Hey traders, welcome back to the FXE YouTube channel. Apologies for the delay in getting this weekend analysis uploaded. It's been quite a hectic weekend for me. I went to a festival yesterday here in Tokyo. I revamped my trading setup. I even did a lot of review on certain price patterns that I've been seeing recently and completely revamped my journaling process. So quite a productive weekend and got a lot accomplished. But anyways, for today's video, I'll review the charts, do the normal top-down analysis, and give some thoughts on the markets thereafter. But first, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get into it. So starting with the fundamentals, for this week, we have an update on inflation numbers. We have CPI on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we have PPI, as well as retail sales, and on Thursday we have unemployment claims. So this week could potentially be a week for some big moves depending on that inflation data. Okay, now moving on to the charts, starting with the yields. You can see that they've come up quite a bit. The 5-year has gone through the lower daily fair value gap and has come into the upper daily fair value gap. The 10-year and the 30-year aren't near as aggressive, but it looks like they want to come up a little higher. So what I'll be looking for next is to see if we get a reaction from these inefficient areas. So for the 10-year and the 30-year, that would be the lower daily fair value gap. And on the 5-year, it would be the upper daily fair value gap that it's currently in. And I also had a look at the downside targets. You can see on the 10-year and the 30-year, there is obvious areas of inefficiency below. But if you look a little further down, there's an inefficient area that's consistent on all three charts with resting liquidity just above it. I see this as a really good area for the yields to eventually reach down to, and then potentially that could be where we have the reversal or the reaction and then the reversal to push up and continue higher. Now if we have a quick look at the majors, you can see that they're all coming down. GU and NU seem to be correlated the most in the way price action is moving. EU seems to be the strongest of the bunch. It's failed to break structure while the others have. And AU, on the other hand, is the weakest of all of them. It's pushing down the most aggressively. Now on to DXY, starting with the monthly time frame. So structure is obviously bullish. You can see that we've come down on the last candle, came in to about 50% of the monthly fair value gap, and after coming down we've actually had a reaction and it's starting to push up now. Could be a reaction to pull back into inefficient areas or potentially a reversal to continue back to the upside. On this time frame and the current Powell sentiment, makes me think that the pullback may be over and DXY continues to the upside from here. So I will be focused on the lower time frames for that confirmation, as well as look for opportunities for reactions at inefficient levels for lower pricing. Now moving on to the weekly time frame. So structure is obviously bullish. You can see that we've swept the internal liquidity and currently having a significant reaction. So I can see two potential stories here. The first being an aggressive sweep of the sell side liquidity coming into the monthly fair value gap and now reversing to continue its run higher. The second story I can see is the start of a bigger pullback. After an aggressive push to the downside, DXY is now pulling back to inefficient areas and thereafter will continue lower for a bigger pullback in the overall range of the last weekly leg to the upside. There are arguments for both stories. The monthly picture as well as market sentiment are in favor of the first story, while daily structure and lower time frame PD arrays are showing that lower pricing could also make as much sense, as well as the fact that it would make sense for DXY to come down into these discount levels before reversing and pushing to create higher highs. For the time being, I don't have any strong bias either way on this time frame. Now moving on to the daily time frame. So we start to see a different picture here. We can see that DXY is bearish. We are creating lower lows. And after that last aggressive move to the downside, you can see we swept internal liquidity, come into the monthly fair value gap, and now DXY is currently pulling back. And you can also see that bullish PD arrays are being respected. So we created a daily fair value gap here, we tapped into it, and then continued higher. Also, the daily bearish fair value gap to the left has been broken, and DXY is attempting to push higher. There are lower time frame bearish PD arrays that are currently being respected, and that's why we have this current pullback right now. But my guess is it's just a reaction, and we'll probably see further continuation higher. There's also unmitigated daily fair value gap above and that daily volume imbalance above that we may see DXY reach for. For now, price action looks quite corrective, so continuing higher to inefficient pricing still makes sense before any reversals. But there are still inefficiencies below in this weekly range, and we're still very far from reaching discount levels. So if we have a quick look, our discount level is right here. We have a daily fair value gap just above it, and we also have a weekly fair value gap towards the bottom, and that would bring us into OT levels. So on this time frame, I'm hoping that we will eventually see DXY reach the daily fair value gap above and see if we get a reaction there for potential reversals to bring the price lower into the discount of the weekly range. At the same time, I will also be watching DXY closely. If it reaches the lower end of the current daily range, as I do see potential for DXY to just continue higher without reaching those discount levels of the weekly range. And just having a really quick look at the hourly time frame before we move on to EU. So this is what I was referring to when I said we're currently reacting off lower time frame PD arrays. So there's an hourly fair value gap right here that we tapped into twice, had a reaction off of it. So my guess is maybe we'll come down somewhere, maybe on this last drive up, like this hourly fair value gap, tap into that before reversing to target the daily fair value gap and potentially the volume imbalance above. Now moving on to EU, starting with the monthly time frame. So what we can see is structure is clearly bearish. As of right now, we're currently pulling back from this aggressive push to the downside. You can see that we nearly came to the 382 fib level, and we've also filled the monthly fair value gap. So the way I look at it now is the inefficiency has been filled and we've pulled away from it. So potentially the pullback is done and we start reversing from here. So what I'll mainly be watching for moving forward is first to see if EU does go back up, and if it does go back up, whether it breaks the highs and continue higher or not, or if it just sweeps liquidity and turns around and starts pushing down again. Because if it does start to push down again, I may start to assume that yes, in fact, the pullback is over and we're going to see lower pricing from here. Now moving on to the weekly time frame. So what we can see is structure is bearish. We've come into the weekly breaker block we don't really have any inefficient levels on this time frame above us, aside from a tiny weekly fair value gap right here that you can barely even see. We do still have room to go higher, but for me, we can just as easily reverse from here. So moving forward, if it does continue higher, then the level I will be watching is a weekly breaker block above. This would bring us into premium levels, and the top of it would bring us to OT of the weekly range. Now moving on to the daily time frame. So once again, this is a time frame where we start to see a different picture. So on this time frame, structure is bullish. We are creating higher highs and higher lows. EU swept, the internal liquidity came into the daily extreme and has come down from there. For now, filling the upper fair value gap. So we've completely filled the upper daily fair value gap, and we do remain bullish. And on this time frame, we do still have inefficiencies above that have been left unmitigated. And I have mixed feelings on EU. Structurally, EU remains bullish. It makes sense to continue higher and go for the inefficiencies above. But the recent Powell sentiment makes me quite cautious. We will have more clarity though when we have that inflation data next week. For now, I do assume it will eventually go back up. It's not the first time we've seen EU come down aggressively and eventually push right back up to create higher highs. The area I will be closely watching is the current area that we're in right now for continuation higher, as well as the daily fair value gap below. If we do continue lower, this is the area I will be watching for potential reversals to take the price right back up. And that also would bring EU to OT levels of the last leg to the upside. For reversals, on the other hand, I'll be watching for a sweep of this liquidity level. So once we sweep that level, we're in the extreme of the overall leg. And I would like to see if we get any reaction or potential shifts in that area for potential reversals to bring the price right back down. Now, if we have a quick look on the hourly time frame, I'm not going to do a weekly review this week. You can see price action was quite messy. It's mostly seek and destroy, where we're just taking the highs and the lows on both sides over and over. But what I will do is focus on the most recent price action and the key areas of interest. So what you can see is we've already had a shift in structure on the hourly time frame, and then thereafter we had a retest of the demand, and then we start to push right back up. So potentially we may see price come right back up from here, but that's not to say that it's just going to go to the moon from here, because I could see price coming to this hourly fair value gap, then reversing and coming lower. So the key areas of interest that I'm watching are the hourly fair value gap just above. So if we get a reaction from there and a potential shift, then I will look for shorts to see if we can bring the price a little lower. We do have an hourly fair value gap below, and all of this could just be building of sell side liquidity in order to go through all of that to bring the price a little lower. So this hourly fair value gap could make a lot of sense. But what would make more sense is if price came all the way down to the daily fair value gap, which would bring it not only into discount, but also into OT levels. And at that point, that will probably be where I'll be looking for reactions and shifts for potential reversals to bring the price higher and potentially create a higher high. But on the upside, this buy side liquidity, I'll keep my eye on, because a sweep of that, we could come into an hourly fair value gap or potentially the extreme and see a reversal and price come right back down. So as I said, I don't have a strong bias either way. I do see potential for EU to continue higher to the upside and reach the fair value gap above. But at the same time, I could also see this buy side liquidity going and then a reversal to bring the price right back down. So I'm quite neutral right now. But it's just the key areas that I'll be focusing on, because that's where we'll probably see at least some short-term big moves. So if we get into this fair value gap, we may potentially see a move from here to here or here, which in itself would be a massive move. And then if we do see a reaction from the bullish fair value gaps, so whether it be the hourly one or the daily one, and then price pushing right back up to this buy side liquidity, that's a massive move. So if we're able to get into those, take profits, and then what happens after that, we just wait and see. So just to sum up, I don't really have a strong bias right now. I want to see more confirmation. I can really see EU going either way. I'll be less aggressive on my TPs and taking much more off at relevant levels than I did last week. And next week, I will eagerly await to see that inflation data, to see if it's in line with what Powell was saying or if he was just blowing smoke. And if the fundamentals do drive Dixie down, then my bias will shift right back to bullish on EU. Anyways, that's it for this weekend's update. Hopefully you guys found some value in today's video. And if you did, a like and a subscribe would be appreciated. Enjoy the rest of the weekend, and I'll see you for the next one. Peace.
Black Swan.